The Galactic Empire was not a single nation or culture, but a vast amalgamation of thousands of species bound together under the same iron rule. It had stood for millennia, not through benevolence or cooperation, but through fear, the methodical application of overwhelming force, and the crushing of every rebellion that dared rise against it. When the Empire looked upon humanity, it saw not equals, not even competitors, but raw material to be consumed. Earth was a backwater world with little strategic value beyond its stubborn inhabitants, yet that stubbornness made them more trouble than they were worth. Where most species quickly submitted to imperial authority, humanity resisted, clawing back ground even when it seemed impossible. It was not industrial power or fleets or technology that made them dangerous. It was something else, something no strategist could quantify and no scientist could explain. Among those who stood tallest in this resistance were two women, generals who had come from obscurity to become symbols. They were not appointed by any council, nor crowned by any sovereign. They rose because in times of desperation, the human spirit finds its leaders in the ones who refuse to bow. One commanded with discipline and intellect, weaving together fractured militias into something resembling an army. The other inspired through fire, igniting courage in people who thought themselves broken. Together, they became a matched pair, known across colonies and war fronts, not simply for victories on the battlefield, but for the way their very names carried hope. Soldiers spoke of them as saviors. Civilians whispered them as proof that humanity could not only survive but win. For years, their campaigns struck blows against the Empire that should have been impossible. With fewer ships, fewer soldiers, and almost no resources, they shattered detachments meant to grind them down. They understood the weaknesses of giants: arrogance, inflexibility, over-reliance on terror. Against those flaws, the two generals carved out space for humanity to breathe, striking quick and vanishing before retribution could land. Outposts that had never feared attack now reinforced their walls. Imperial officers who once sneered at humans began to plan cautiously. For the first time in living memory, the Empire regarded humanity not merely as vermin, but as a problem requiring attention. And attention came in the form of overwhelming retaliation. Fleets darkened skies over human colonies. Blockades choked supplies. But wherever the Empire pressed, the women responded with brilliance. One turned logistics into weapons, bleeding the invaders by forcing them to overextend. The other rallied ordinary men and women, civilians who had never worn armor, to fight as though they were veterans. In a galaxy where most resistance collapsed at the first sign of overwhelming power, humanity stood. And at the heart of that defiance were the two women. Their enemies hated them not just because they fought well, but because they represented something infectious. Across alien species, whispers spread of human generals who stood against the impossible. The Empire depended on fear to hold its subjects in line, but fear began to crack when beings who had long submitted looked to humanity and saw an alternative. The generals had become dangerous not only militarily, but politically. They had become myths in the making, and myths are harder to kill than armies. So the Empire made a choice. Myths could not be allowed to grow. They would not simply defeat the women. They would erase them, humiliate them, and show every corner of the galaxy the futility of resisting imperial power. A trap was set, not with overwhelming fleets, but with guile the Empire rarely needed to use. False intelligence leaked, promises of vulnerable supply routes left exposed. The women, despite their caution, committed to strike, seeing in the chance to deliver a decisive wound. Instead, they found themselves encircled, their fleets outnumbered 10-1, reinforcements cut off, and betrayal rising from within their own allies, bought or coerced by the Empire. The battle that followed was brutal. Humanity's forces fought as they always had, with ferocity unmatched, but the noose tightened. Ship after ship fell. Colonies that had once cheered for the generals now watched transmissions of their fleets breaking under relentless fire. Even then, the women did not yield. They fought until their ships were burning, until their soldiers had no ammunition left, until surrender was forced upon them. But surrender was not survival. The Empire paraded its captives through the stars. Shackled, stripped of rank, the two women were displayed as trophies. Hollow feeds broadcast their humiliation across the galaxy. They were mocked as pretenders, accused of crimes, declared terrorists rather than warriors. The message was clear: defiance ends in chains. Humanity's greatest daughters were dragged to execution platforms, and there, in public spectacle, the Empire killed them. Not quietly, not mercifully, but with deliberate cruelty meant to sear despair into every watching soul. The effect was immediate. Human resistance fractured, outposts surrendered, militias disbanded. Across colonies, morale collapsed. For many, the sight of their heroines destroyed was proof that the Empire was eternal, that rebellion was futile. Fear crept back into the hearts of those who had once dared to hope. To the Empire, it was a victory more valuable than any battle. They had cut out the heart of human defiance. Or so they believed. In the aftermath, silence fell where once there had been fire. Families wept. Soldiers mourned. But two men watched with a different kind of grief, one that burned instead of withered. They had stood in the shadows while their wives carried banners of war, content to let them shine as leaders while they lived in quiet obscurity. They were not generals, not politicians, not heroes in the public eye. Yet those who knew them, truly knew them, never spoke their names lightly. They were men whispered about even among their own people, figures that belonged not to the ranks of officers but to the realm of nightmare. One had roots in Eastern Europe, where the old stories never truly died. He had been called many things, but the one that endured was Baba Yaga, not the witch of children's tales, but the man those stories had reshaped, the human who became a legend among killers. The other came from America, where war bred its own demons. His enemies called him the Boogeyman, not because he sought the title, but because in battlefield after battlefield, he became the shadow that stalked the night, the death that came for those who thought themselves untouchable. Both had hidden in plain sight, bound by the love they bore for the women now taken from them. The Empire thought it had extinguished hope by killing the generals. What it had done, instead, was break the chains restraining two monsters. In every culture across the stars, stories existed of creatures that parents whispered to frighten children into obedience. Humanity, too, had such figures. But unlike other species, humanity's myths often had roots in reality. The Empire, arrogant and blind, had mistaken restraint for weakness. They had seen two generals as a pinnacle of human defiance, never imagining that behind them stood husbands far more dangerous, men who had lived not as symbols of hope, but as embodiments of fear. Grief has many shapes. For most it is a crushing weight, an anchor that drags them into silence and despair. For some it is fire, consuming everything until nothing is left. For the husbands of slain generals, grief was neither weight nor fire. It was a blade, honed to a single point, sharpened beyond all reason, aimed entirely at the heart of the Empire. They did not rage in public. They did not collapse before the eyes of mourners. They vanished into silence, and that silence was more terrifying than any scream. The first was already a ghost long, before his wife became a general. He had walked the shadowed corridors of war zones where no law applied, where soldiers whispered about him but never dared speak too loud. He was the one enemies prayed not to meet in the dark, the one whose name was never written because names had power. To the Russians he was Baba Yaga, not the witch but the human embodiment of her terror, the relentless hunter who did not stop until the target was nothing but bones. His wife's brilliance had kept him anchored, pulling him away from the abyss, giving him purpose beyond the kill. But the moment she fell, the abyss opened again, and this time nothing held him back. The other was a shadow born of American wars, the figure soldiers conjured when they wanted to frighten each other into silence around campfires. He was the Boogeyman, a predator who moved through conflict like a storm, leaving silence in his wake. He had no official record, no public history, only fragments of stories, whispered rumors, corpses without explanation. His wife had been his light, the reason he restrained himself, the only one who saw the man beneath the shadow. When she was taken, the man died, and only the shadow remained. The Empire had calculated that killing the generals would cripple human morale. What they had not calculated was the unleashing of the two figures who had deliberately stayed outside the wars until now. To them, the conflict had always been something their wives carried, their fight, their cause. Now it was personal. The galaxy had seen warriors and rebels, but had never seen predators unleashed with nothing left to lose. Their vengeance did not begin with grand battles. Battles were for soldiers, fleets, and armies. Vengeance began with silence, with the disappearance of an outpost garrison that never reported back. At first, it was dismissed as sabotage, an accident, another colony uprising. Then another garrison vanished, this time leaving behind a scene that defied rationality. Entire squads executed with precision. Officers hung from rafters like trophies, imperial insignias defiled with blood. There was no plea for peace, no message in negotiation. Only a single phrase carved into steel, repeated in languages across the galaxy. We are coming. Fear travels faster than ships. Within weeks, Imperial officers began requesting reassignment, fearing duty in human sectors. Entire detachments filed reports of hearing voices in the dark, of movements too fast to track, of comrades disappearing without a sound. The Empire, accustomed to inspiring fear, now found its soldiers drowning in it. Every patrol became a death march. Every quiet night was stalked by the thought of footsteps behind them. The generals had led armies. Their husbands waged war on the mind. What made them unstoppable was not technology or numbers. It was their refusal to fight by the rules the Empire understood. Fleets could be countered with fleets, armies with armies, but fear could not be measured. When supply ships were hijacked and return days later filled with corpses arranged in grotesque displays, the Empire realized this was no rebellion. This was something older, something primal. For the first time in centuries, the Empire's soldiers looked at an enemy and saw not rebels, but monsters. Baba Yaga struck with cold precision. His killings were messages, crafted with deliberate care. He wanted every officer, every soldier, to know exactly what had happened and to imagine it happening to them. He left trails not of chaos, but of certainty. That death was inevitable, that resistance was meaningless. The Boogeyman, by contrast, thrived in unpredictability. He left nothing consistent, nothing safe. Entire bases would vanish with no trace. Sometimes he killed none, leaving survivors to spread tales of his presence. Sometimes he killed all, leaving only echoes of screams recorded in black boxes. Together, they created a symphony of terror, one note methodical, the other chaotic, until the Empire could no longer distinguish where the next strike would fall. The human colonies that faltered after generals' deaths now found themselves awakening again. They saw the destruction left in the wake of the two husbands, and for the first time since the executions, hope returned. Not the bright hope of victory, but the darker, sharper hope of vengeance. To fight for freedom was noble, but to fight for vengeance was unstoppable. Colonies that had surrendered took up arms again. Guerrilla cells reformed. The myth of Baba Yaga and the Boogeyman spread farther than the generals' reputations ever had, because myths of fear are louder than myths of hope. The Empire responded with fury. Fleets were dispatched specifically to hunt them down. Bounties were placed so high that mercenaries from across the galaxy flooded human space, each hoping to claim the prize. None returned. Some disappeared entirely. Others reappeared in pieces, their ships drifting as hollow coffins. The bounties only fed the legend. For every hunter that failed, the fear grew. Soldiers who had once joked about human stubbornness now prayed they would never be sent to fight them. As the campaign continued, it was no longer clear whether the husbands were men or something beyond men. Witnesses spoke of seeing shadows move where no one stood, of hearing footsteps in the absence of sound, of eyes glowing in the dark. Rational minds dismissed these as fear-induced hallucinations, but to soldiers living under constant dread, the stories were real, and reality no longer mattered. In war, perception is often deadlier than truth. The Empire's control began to erode, not because of massive defeats, but because its armies were paralyzed by dread. Supply chains faltered when crews abandoned ships mid-transit. Occupied colonies rose up when they sensed weakness. Other species, long cowed into obedience, began whispering of rebellion. It was said that if humanity could fight, so could they, yet no one dared act openly, for the Empire still wielded overwhelming might. What spread instead was a different kind of rebellion. The rebellion of thought, the dangerous belief that the Empire was not eternal, the The two men never declared themselves leaders, never raised banners, never claimed to represent humanity. They did not speak to the galaxy. They did not explain themselves. They moved through the darkness, killing, striking, leaving nothing but fear behind. And because they never spoke, others spoke for them. Rumors grew unchecked. Legends flourished, each tale larger than the last. Some said Baba Yaga could not die, that bullets passed through him. Others swore the boogeyman was not human at all, but a creature born of shadow. Truth and fiction merged, creating a myth larger than reality. The Empire had long believed itself immortal. It had crushed 1,000 rebellions, eradicated entire species, and stood untouched while civilizations rose and fell around it. Its power lay not only in weapons but in certainty, the unshakable conviction that resistance was futile and that any who defied would be broken. That certainty began to unravel the moment the two men struck. At first, the Empire dismissed the attacks as anomalies, isolated acts of vengeance from grieving widowers. But when fleets collapsed, outposts were abandoned, and soldiers refused deployment, it became clear these were not isolated strikes. This was war, though not the kind of war the Empire understood. The generals' deaths had been meant to destroy morale. Instead, they had given birth to terror. Baba Yaga and the boogeyman had no armies, no fleets, no banners, yet they wielded a weapon far deadlier: inevitability. Every strike was chosen not for tactical value alone, but for psychological devastation. Admirals awoke to find their families gone, only to receive transmissions of their screams hours later. Governors discovered their palaces turned into graves, their guards butchered in silence. Supply depots erupted into fire, leaving nothing but carved symbols etched into surviving walls. No one knew how the two men traveled so far, so fast, or how they always knew where to strike. The galaxy whispered that they were not moving through ships at all, but through shadows, slipping from one battlefield to another as if distance no longer applied to them. In desperation, the Empire escalated. It gathered armadas larger than some entire civilizations had ever seen. Worlds were fortified, soldiers equipped with new weapons designed to counter human physiology. Assassins, mercenaries, even alien warlords were contracted with promises of wealth and power. Yet every attempt ended the same way: silence. The armadas crumbled from within as officers were found executed in their quarters. Fortresses meant to be unassailable were found emptied, their defenders slaughtered without alarms ever being raised. Mercenaries who came seeking glory were found hanging in orbit, their bodies drifting as warnings. No matter how vast the Empire's resources, they were bleeding faster than they could recover. It was not just fear spreading among the soldiers now. It was doubt. For centuries, the Empire had told its subjects that resistance was hopeless. Now, whispers suggested otherwise. If two humans could bring the Empire to its knees, perhaps the Empire was not eternal after all. Across conquered worlds, subjugated species began to test boundaries. Protests erupted. Strikes spread. Small rebellions flared, emboldened not by promises of victory, but by the knowledge that the Empire bled like any tyrant. Humanity had sparked the first flame, and the fire was spreading galaxy-wide. The Empire tried to silence these whispers with brutality. Colonies suspected of rebellion were purged, cities razed, populations slaughtered. But these acts of cruelty only deepened the resolve of those who had once lived in fear. Fear had shifted sides. Where once the Empire wielded it, now the people did. And at the heart of that transformation were two men who asked nothing of anyone, demanded no allegiance, and yet commanded loyalty through their very existence. The boogeyman thrived in unpredictability, striking at the Empire's heart with madness that seemed random but always carried meaning. One night, an Admiral's warship was found drifting with the crew intact but blind, their eyes burned out by some unknown method. Another time, an entire fleet disappeared, only to reappear weeks later arranged into a grotesque monument of twisted metal and frozen corpses orbiting a barren star. He left no explanations, only horror. Baba Yaga, by contrast, was precise. His killings followed patterns, designed to instill certainty of doom. He dismantled logistics, disrupted command structures, executed officers in ways that mirrored ancient rituals of execution. Together, they embodied chaos and order, nightmare and inevitability. until the empire could no longer distinguish which enemy it feared more. The capital itself was no longer safe. Noble families fortified their estates. Senators traveled only with entire battalions of guards, yet still the killings reached them. A minister who had overseen the general's execution was found crucified upon the spires of the imperial palace. Another who had mocked humanity during the trials was discovered at his dining table, surrounded by his family, all poisoned, their faces contorted in silent screams. The message was clear. None were beyond reach. The empire's leaders had turned the general's deaths into a spectacle to crush defiance. Their husbands now returned that spectacle in kind, feeding terror back into the veins of power. But their war was not simply vengeance. It was transformation. Humanity itself began to change under their shadow. Colonies that once saw themselves as victims now carried themselves with pride. Soldiers fought harder. Civilians endured longer because they believed monsters fought for them. Entire generations grew up with the legend that two men could stand against an empire. That belief hardened into identity, and identity into unity. Humanity, once scattered and weak, became unbreakable not through fleets or weapons, but through myth. At last, the empire realized that this was not a problem to be solved with force. It was a war for perception, and they were losing. They attempted to spin propaganda, to claim victories where there were none, to downplay the losses. But in an age of transmission and rumor, lies could not hold. Every destroyed fleet, every slain noble, every vanished outpost carried its own proof, and proof is stronger than propaganda. So the empire made one final gamble. The emperor himself summoned his greatest forces, a fleet so massive it blotted out the stars, to launch a decisive campaign into human space. The goal was simple: burn every colony, erase every trace, and the myth by exterminating its people. If humanity no longer existed, neither would its monsters. The fleets advanced, and for a time it seemed the empire would succeed. Entire planets burned. Billions died. Yet even as humanity bled, the predators struck deeper than ever before. Entire command vessels were found drifting without crew. Admirals vanished from their own war councils. Supply lines collapsed, leaving fleets stranded and starving in hostile space. Every victory the empire claimed was poisoned by losses they could not explain, by terror they could not control. Soldiers fought not with pride but with dread, knowing death stalked them even when no enemy fleet was near. And then, in the heart of the capital, the nightmare became real. No alarm sounded, no defenses engaged. One moment the emperor presided over his court. The next, the court was filled with screams. None saw them enter, but all saw what came next. The emperor, who had ordered the generals' deaths, who had ruled through fear for centuries, was dragged from his throne. His guards died without sound. His courtiers fled in terror. When dawn came, his body hung above the palace, carved with words in ancient human tongue. "We do not bow."